This is a group of people who have worked in Myanmar. We spent a lot of time talking about the United States. We spent a little bit of time talking about what's going on in Europe, what's going on in Africa. And now we want to spend a little bit of time talking about what's going on even farther away. And one of the reasons I think this panel is particularly interesting, not just because it addresses a different part of the world, but it addresses an incredibly constructive relationship between the press, between lawyers, between civil society people, and reporters and tech working together for the greater good. So we're really privileged to have Robert Rosenthal, again, one of our earliest supporters in this summit and someone who has really guided us from the earliest days of our creation as the moderator of this panel. So Robert, do you want to lead us off?
Thank you. And thank you everyone for being here. And you know, we're here for reasons as we've heard, we'd rather not be, but you know, I'm a big believer that out of trauma, personal trauma, communal trauma, as journalists in your own life, you can really, if you can accept certain things, and you can learn a great deal from that. So my name's Robert Rosenthal, as you just heard, and I'm a lifelong journalist. And I've asked this panel also to tell a little bit about themselves before we get going, because I think one of the key things here over the last day and a half that we're all hearing and learning about each other is passion. And passion, wherever it comes from, to do what we hope to do that makes a difference in our careers. You know, I don't think, besides the filmmakers, there are no other journalists here, I don't think, really. But just a little bit about me. When I was 22, I actually worked on the Pentagon Papers as an editorial assistant. I was in the Hilton Hotel, part of the secret team. And I was just a few months out of college. But that learning for me really became one of the foundational pillars of my career. It was really about taking risks, standing up to authority, and also the impact of work. So that pillar also makes me believe that one of the strongest pillars of our democracy is the free press, which is also under assault. So as my career evolved, I worked in corporate media, I ran big newspapers, but the last part of my career was really in a different model. And I think it's relevant today in what we're doing here, because that model at the Center for Investigative Reporting in California was really based not only in the work of the journalists, but partnering and collaborating with non-traditional organizations, not only journalists, but nonprofits, other researchers, to do work you could not do without their support. And within the network, each node could really, when it was activated and connected, could really make a difference. So today, I'm on the board of the Human Rights Center in Berkeley, and today we're going to actually hear about a solution or an outcome that grew out of research by non-traditional actors, really, the Human Rights Center, working with journalists. That also led to stories that were part of a package of stories that won the Pulitzer Prize a few years ago for Reuters, and a reporter named Steve Stecklow, who worked for Reuters, and others, on the hate speech that led to the genocidal actions, really, against the Rohingya. So Alexa Koenig, Executive Director, why don't you kick it off and tell a little bit about yourself and also what HRC does.
Okay, great. Nice to see all of you, and thank you so much for having us here. I'm Alexa Koenig. As Robert mentioned, I'm the Executive Director for the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley. I also direct our Technology and Human Rights program, and I'm co-founder with Andrea, who's on the stage as well, of something called the Investigations Lab that was set up to help source information from social media about different atrocities and different incidents that are taking place around the world. So the Human Rights Center is a multidisciplinary research center. It pulls together people from very different disciplines, whether journalists, public health practitioners, lawyers, et cetera, to work on issues of mutual interest and concern, particularly in the human and civil rights space. We launched in 1994, so have been around for close to 30 years, but the story of how we started really begins about 2 decades earlier. And it starts in Argentina, when a young man named Eric Stover was backpacking through the country. He had a letter from the Associated Press in his backpack and was working on a series of stories about the conflict that was breaking out in the country. He happened to be there with his brother the night of the military coup in March of 1976. And that night, he was thrown in prison with his brother and a number of other individuals, students, activists, lawyers, documenters of all kinds, ended up in that jail cell with them that night. And he's told the story before about how they tore up their shirts and they bandaged each other's wounds. And in the morning, he and his brother were evicted from the country. They had American passports and so were allowed to leave. But many of the people that he was jailed with that night were never heard from again. And that ultimately changed the course of his career from journalism to starting to work in human rights, going on to Amnesty and other places. In 1983, at the end of that really conflicted period, 3 women came to him in his office. At the time, he was working at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and one of the 3 women pulled from her handbag a crumpled piece of newspaper. The article that she had saved was about the potential of a very new form of technology, DNA technology, to prove the paternity of an individual. It turned out that these 3 women were representatives of the grandmothers of the Plaza del Mayo, who many of you may have heard of, and they told the story about how their children, they had heard that their children were pregnant when they were detained by the military junta, and it being a Catholic regime, the women who were pregnant were not killed immediately, but they were allowed to give birth to their babies, and at least one of them had heard about her daughter having the chance to hold the child before she was taken and killed, and these babies were adopted off. And now these 3 grandmothers wanted to see if DNA technology could be used to help reunite the infants with them as their grandparents. Eric said, I don't know, but I know some people who might, and let me go find out. And it started a travel to Argentina with a forensic anthropologist and others. When he got to Argentina to try to work on this issue, it was still so politically contested that no one who was a professional would touch the issue of the disappeared, including of these disappeared children. So he ended up banding together with students, and they began pioneering a number of methodologies for beginning to identify individuals who'd been killed and disappeared during the regime. Fast forward to 1996 when he's at Berkeley, and that launched a career of really looking at how new and emerging technologies can be helpful for documenting atrocities around the world. In 2009, we hosted the world's first coming together of technologists and human rights practitioners in an event called The Soul of the New Machine. It was set up to look at digital technology and how it was making new possibilities available for documentation of horrific crimes around the world. In 2011, we began looking at why a number of court systems, including the International Criminal Court, had failed to advance to later stages of prosecution around some of the world's most horrific crimes. We sent a researcher to the court. She went through thousands of pages of court filings and came back and said, what the judges are saying is that the prosecutors are over-relying on the stories of survivors, of witnesses, without bringing in the corroborating information needed to bring the tales that they're telling to some kind of forensic standard. So we began asking the question, in what ways are other newer forms of information coming about that can be there to help support the stories that survivors are telling about what they witnessed and the who, what, when, where, why of these atrocities? We began working with people who were looking at satellite imagery. If you think of 2011, it was the rise of the smartphone. It was certainly the proliferation of social media across the globe. Drone technology was taking off for hobbyists at the time. So all of these became new sources of data that could help to support or disprove what witnesses to atrocity were saying. Out of that, we recognize the extraordinary potential of social media content to help with this process. As all of you likely know, more than 500 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute. Over 6,000 tweets are being generated every second. One of the hardest things to do when trying to get a prosecution or accountability for genocide and hate is to actually prove the networks of complicity, going all the way up to the highest level perpetrator, who is often the person that these international tribunals are mandated to go after. But what better way to prove a social network than to use social networking? So we began to see and think about how on an international campus of 55,000 people, we could harness the tremendous talent and skills of the students, of the faculty, and come together to figure out new methodologies for mining this kind of information in support of justice. In 2016, Andrea and I launched the Human Rights Investigations Lab in partnership with Amnesty International, the Center for Justice and Accountability, which is a human rights law firm, to basically teach both students and professionals how to mine social media and other public places online for information related to cases or stories that they were building, but also how to verify that content so they knew how trustworthy it could be. We started with 3 end users in mind. We would pull this information together for human rights researchers. We've worked with Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Physicians for Human Rights, also grassroots organizations, but also for investigative reporters and other journalists, and Andrea is going to speak a little bit more about our work in that space. And then finally for legal practitioners, which we define quite broadly to include United Nations Commissions of Inquiry and other groups that are trying to build the facts to eventually find some kind of reparation for survivors and justice for the perpetrators. As we've been doing this work, we realized that this was such a relatively new area of practice in law, that there were very few standards, and in fact, sometimes quite conflicting definitions around the kinds of information that we were relying on. So we began working with technologists, legal investigators, and others to pull together what just launched this past December in partnership with the United Nations Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights. It's called the Berkeley Protocol on Digital Open Source Investigations. And what it is basically a set of guidelines to help bring some systematicity and some understanding of the forensic capabilities of these new forms of digital content to help build these evidentiary records, whether for advocacy or for legal justice. As part of that, one of the things that the Berkeley Protocol includes is a definition for online open source investigations. In a nutshell, what we'll be talking about today are investigations that rely on publicly accessible information from the internet that any member of the public who has access to the internet can basically pull in through observation, meaning you put in your search term in a platform like Google and you see what pops up. By request, so for example, registering to get access to a website, or by purchase, so something like a subscription to the New York Times or some other publication that requires a nominal fee. It doesn't include information where you need a special status, like to be law enforcement, in order to access it, and it doesn't include information that might be obtained through illegal means like hacking. So it has to be something that's fairly equitable. Throughout all of this, our hope is that these guidelines will be helpful to certainly legal practitioners, but also to journalists and citizen documenters who are trying to gather information about the crimes they have experienced themselves, or that the people and the NGOs and the survivors of these atrocities have actually experienced, to help build that historical record. So with that, I'd love to turn to Andrea.
I want to interject something here for context, because traditionally, newsrooms would not work with an organization like HRC, but in the last 10 years, we've seen an evolution on collaboration and partnerships, which is really an important theme of what we're doing here, creating new and unusual partnerships where you bring strength to strength. So what journalists do are storytellers, obviously, but we don't have, most newsrooms don't have the resources or the knowledge or the ability to do that kind of investigative work. So just for a journalism organization to work with HRC takes a lot of discussion, because they're not only getting the data, they're also sharing it with prosecutors, they're training prosecutors and researchers, and they're working with journalists. So again, this is very non-traditional, but the outcome is extraordinarily powerful. And Andrea Lampros can describe some of the other partnerships, or mention the other partners, and go into what happened with Reuters and the backstory on how that happened.
Great, thank you, Robert. I think one of the great parts of the last few days, at least for me, is while there's so much pain here, and I want to first thank the families and the survivors, the people who have been sharing their stories and teaching us about kind of the way forward in this work. I've also found so much hope. I just came from the session on art, and seeing some of the films and seeing some of the art that's there in this moment. It just is inspiring about the resistance, but also the hope for the future. And that's what gives me so much hope about the work we've been doing, and really is pertinent to the way forward. And that's what the students at UC Berkeley, it's just a slice of that, but we also work with students all over the world. And as Alexa said, we founded in 2016 this laboratory to conduct these open source investigations. So to work with real world partners, journalists, lawyers, advocates, and advocacy organizations. These students come from all over campus. They speak multiple languages, like sometimes 25 languages in any cohort, and they come from maybe 30 disciplines. They're undergraduates, graduate students, and they're there to work, again, to combat hate, to investigate human rights, to work for justice, and they spend their time going deep and looking at the social media that is all around us and mining that for information about human rights and to work with real-world partners. So I wanted to talk just about some of these partnerships. One of the very first was with ProPublica, and that was on a project called Documenting Hate. And it was in the wake of the 2016 elections. We were seeing the rise of hate. And ProPublica came to us and to other students around the country and to student campus newspapers and others and said, can you document what you're seeing out there in social media? Because there's so much, and we need to find it so that we can write about it. And so that's what we did, and we had a team of students in that case that was scouring social media, whether it was Twitter or Facebook, and mining that for leads. So sometimes there would be, in a small town somewhere, a swastika painted on a barn. And it wouldn't get any publicity or news, but we would find that tweet of someone who had uploaded that, and we would share that with ProPublica. Or perhaps there would be somebody screaming about anti-immigrant, with anti-immigrant hate on the subway, and somebody captured that and uploaded it, and then we would document that and share it. And in total, I think somewhere around 6,000 pieces of content were documented, and from that, about 230 stories were written. So that was one of those first projects that we did, and with one of these news partners. We turned to Myanmar, and that's what we're going to talk a lot about today, is a project we did on Myanmar, many projects related to the conflict in Myanmar and to ongoing strife and tension there. We came to this work, as Alexa had mentioned, our faculty director has worked around the world on human rights crises, and he had done a lot of work in Myanmar, and so brought that real-world context to what we were doing. But we knew it was in 2017, this was before a lot of the alleged genocide that you may have heard of, and we started to document what was happening and what we were seeing on social media. And of course, there were tensions in Myanmar among religious groups. Muslims were often repressed in that context. And at that time, there was just a really quick rise in the use of cell phones, which meant the rise in the use of the internet. And then in Myanmar, what that meant was Facebook, because in Myanmar at that time, Facebook was the internet. And so we saw a very quick rise in the use of social media, and we also saw those tensions and the hatred that had been existing spill into that online context. And so we started to document what we were seeing and to look at some of the hateful tweets, well, actually Facebook posts that were up from, first from a monk named Wiratu, who some of you may be familiar with, who was a Buddhist monk who was spewing terrible hate against the Rohingya population, calling them dogs and insects and worse, and telling people that they shouldn't shop in Muslim shops or that Muslims would drive them out. It was hate speech, and it was up on the internet, and it was up for a long time. And that was also influencing others who were coming on to the online space. So we started to document his statements and also other people who were kind of making statements from that. And so that was sort of that kind of underlying context. And then Steve Stecklow, who Robert had mentioned, who is an incredible investigative reporter with Reuters, had heard about what we were doing. And he came to us and said, I have an idea. I want to document all of the hateful posts that are still up on the Facebook platform long after they were supposed to have been taken down. All those posts that violate the terms and conditions of Facebook. Can you help it? Can you help me? You have students. And so that's the beauty of this kind of collaboration, is that we have so many students who could then jump on that project, and we assembled a team. This was after the ethnic cleansing or alleged genocide that happened that drove some 900,000 Rohingya out of Myanmar to Bangladesh. hundreds of homes and villages burned and people killed, and a terrible crisis in a very short amount of time. And a lot of that real-world violence was accompanied by this online hate. And so that's what we started to document for Steve. The students spent the summer doing this work, not the best summer vacation, documenting hate on Facebook. But they did that, and we turned those posts over to Steve. We had Brian's gonna walk through a little bit of the methodology of this, but how we did it is we had to find, and you'll see some of these up, we had to find what were the key words in Burmese that will help us find these things, and then what were the phrases. And we had one Burmese speaker who helped us kind of navigate that. But the students were adept at using very advanced searches and search terms to find these things and to pull them down off of Facebook and to do it very manually and to document this. And then we checked the work. Others at Reuters, we worked with them and they also checked these pieces, and we turned this over to Reuters, and it was part of a package that Steve wrote an incredible story, and that was part of a package that won the Pulitzer Prize. But as you can see from these slides, the kinds of hate that was up on the Facebook platform, not just for a little while, but for a long while, for years. Some of these tweets, or some of these Facebook posts are up from perhaps 2013, 2014, and it's documented that these were up online, and then those were feeding this story. So that's one of the first investigations we did. As you will hear from Alexa later, this not only had an impact on this story that was done to show what was happening, but it also has some legal implications that we'll also talk about.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in. Steve obviously also worked with other sources, but he had heard, again, through the grapevine about what Human Rights Center was doing and made the unusual approach. And the story really did lay out Facebook's inability to keep track of what was on the platform. And they made changes. I know there's other stories probably still in the pipeline, but that was sort of the context, and it was part of a package, as I said, that did win the Pulitzer Prize for what was happening in Myanmar. So.
And I should say, I forgot I was going to set up a little bit about what Brian's going to talk about, which is that's where we didn't end there with Myanmar. We continue to investigate for various partners, but the next partner we worked with in terms of media was with the Associated Press. So they came to us, they had known about this story that we had done, and they asked us, this was in a slightly different context, but also in Myanmar, with some violence that happened in the wake of the coup that happened in February of 2021. We were seeing massive repression happening. This time, there was a lot more social media that was uploaded by people, not only to Facebook, but to Twitter and to other platforms. So we're gonna watch a quick video right now, which will show you some of the methodology that was used in that investigation. While it is not focused on documenting hate per se, it is in the broader context because it's documenting the violence. And it's doing what reporters just didn't have the capacity to do. They weren't in the country. Reuters reporters were jailed also at the time. And the only way to really report on this was through the online context and through open source investigations. So you'll see some of what we did in that investigation here.
More than 800 people have died in Myanmar since the military takeover in February. 17-year-old Ja Min Lat was one of them. His death is among a string of incidents where security forces have grabbed people off the streets, some never to be found again. The tactic has been used in other conflicts worldwide to create fear and anxiety among the population.
What is new is that this is taking place on the street and in public view. Normally, this kind of enforced disappearance takes place at night in the shadows without any public awareness of it.
Together with UC Berkeley's Human Rights Center Investigations Lab, the Associated Press analyzed photos, video, and social media posts and identified more than 130 cases where security forces have beaten, mutilated, or snatched bodies. Witnesses and family members have corroborated several of the accounts.
So this shows all of our incidents that we've identified.
Our initial collection was roughly 2,000 to 3,000 tweets over a span of about 2 months. And so from there, the challenge is just working through the large volume of posts.
So many people are retweeting and reposting the media that's originally circulated. And that in and of itself presents a lot of challenges when it comes to verifying the material, because there will be different claims of what's going on in the video based on who's posting it, based on when it was posted.
Among the posts circulating was the video of Nguyen Lat.
What's really remarkable about this motorcycle incident that happened in Myanmar is that just how well documented it is from the beginning to the end.
Using satellite imagery, screen grabs of the footage, reverse image searches, and a sun shadow calculator, researchers verified the shooting took place in front of a high school in Da Wei on March 27th. The incident begins at 10:38 a.m. with the sound of gunshots captured on CCTV. 16 minutes later, the first image surfaces on social media. The post mentions that a man was taken by the military and asks if anyone recognizes the bike. Within 2 hours, this CCTV footage is shared widely. The picture showed the same fence where Nguyen Lat was shot while riding with 2 other men on a motorcycle. The bike is later left in the same position captured in the photos. When the teen's bodies returned to his family days later, the official death certificate states he died from falling off a motorcycle. Another photo posted by a local news outlet shows a large wound in the teen's neck. Human rights experts say the trove of videos and images from Myanmar could serve another purpose as well.
If individuals who are committing that crime can be identified, it puts them at great legal liability in terms of crimes against humanity.
While Nguyen Lat's family was able to hold a funeral, the military has cremated or secretly buried an unknown number of bodies. After a 13-year-old boy was killed by a stray bullet, his family refused to turn him over to authorities. Instead, they hid the body and cremated him the next day. David Martin, The Associated Press.
So I'll talk a little bit about the process that we went through to ultimately create that video and the report that accompanied, or that we published with the Associated Press. But before I go into the process, I just wanted to give some context to the investigation and the backdrop that we were working in. So on January 30th, in Myanmar, the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, citing election fraud, committed a coup, and General Min Aung Hlaing, one of the orchestrators of the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya in previous years, installed himself as the chairman of the State Administration Council. Democracy activists flooded the streets, demanding democracy, wanting the status quo back. Within a week, the state forces began a violent crackdown, killing up to 1,000 protesters up to date. One of the first units that opened fire on civilians and protesters were the 33rd Light Infantry Division. This unit was the unit that was orchestrating and executing the ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya. So while this investigation didn't focus on hate itself, I think that what we see in the context of this coup and in the violence after is the consequences of impunity and the failure to achieve accountability for perpetrators. So about 1 month after the coup happened, the Associated Press approached us at the Human Rights Center lab to figure out ways that we could extend their capacity to understand what was going on in Myanmar and to find the stories that were critical to be told to provide accountability during this period of time. AP's photographer, Tain Za, was just detained in country along with a number of other local reporters and media, along with other local reporters. Media organizations were shut down, and the network that the AP relied on, their fixers, their sources, were no longer able to operate in the ways that they had before. Additionally, the pandemic was raging, and the local reporters, people in the Southeast Asia Bureau, weren't able to have the access that they had in previous years. They were back in the United States and just weren't able to tap into those networks. So what we did with at the Human Rights Center was that we have something of a playbook by now. We've done a number of investigations where we kind of have a sense of what to do to start up and to quickly achieve results that can be given to our partners for their purposes, whether it's for publishing, legal partners, or advocacy. So what we did was we pulled together a number of students based on technical ability, language ability, as well as just interest. And we quickly just started scouring the internet, trying to see what we could find. We put into a spreadsheet where we shared with our partners, and what we quickly found was that it wasn't hard to actually find these videos. It was the complete opposite. There were so many videos that there was no way that our manual collection process could really find it. We were working within Twitter, Facebook, and other platforms, just searching for specific keywords or content, usually searching for videos showing protests, showing the crackdown on protesters. And we realized that there was a lot going on. There was an immense amount of violence being inflicted on these protesters, and we couldn't process it in a way and keep up with the deluge of content that was coming out each and every day. So partly what we then did was we pivoted. We shifted to a more automated process where we began to scrape information from the internet to try to understand what was going on. What really enabled this was a unique event that happened shortly after the security forces took control in February. They blocked Facebook, and the way that activists responded was that they shifted to platforms like Twitter and Telegram and got the word out that way. Those groups evolved to become coordinated activities where Telegram groups would then translate information that they found, videos, disseminated within Telegram groups, and then users on Twitter would push it out using a number of hashtags, the main one being what's happening in Myanmar, but additionally hashtags like March 27th coup and things like that, where they catalog the events of each and every day. So this created an opportunity for us to then start scraping this information using these hashtags as keywords and really capture a comprehensive picture of what happened every day and really create a beat-by-beat timeline of events as they happened, and then be able to trace back that information to other platforms, whether it originated on Facebook, TikTok, or any number of other platforms. What you see here is the database that we use to store the information, and we created a number of dashboards that allowed us to explore the data quickly and really to zoom in on particular dates and times and understand what was going on. So through this process, we were able to effectively have near real-time updates to understand what the ground situation was like in Myanmar, and we fed this to our partners at the Associated Press, informing their reporting, and their reporting informing our work. At the same time that this happened, one of the reporters on the team forwarded to us a message from someone on the ground showing an NLD official, the opposition to the military junta, who was allegedly arrested by the military, taken away, and then later returned with apparent signs of torture and showing the after effects of an autopsy, effectively. And so the reporter asked us if we could look into this further to see if NLD officials were being targeted or what else was happening to these officials. What we actually found was that there was a widespread, almost indiscriminate use of violence against nearly everyone, not even just protesters, where often security forces were shooting people on the street, taking them away, some of them never to be found again, others returned with gruesome scars, and others returned with causes of death that absolutely did not match what the context of their death actually showed. So we began to realize that this was probably the story to tell at this moment, that there was widespread violence happening and that security forces were terrorizing its citizens in extreme and gruesome ways. So using this database that we created, we were able to create a universe of data that we could then query and find these incidents of what we euphemistically called as body snatching, where security forces were taking people and returning them in ways to terrorize its citizens. We ultimately found over 130 incidents where we could confidently say that security forces were taking individuals. Sometimes, in the worst incident, we found over 80 people were arrested, killed, or taken and just never seen again. What we then did was we engaged in the traditional process of open source research. We now had our universe of cases. We had a number of alleged incidents. So we went through a process of additional research to establish additional information. Could we find their names? Could we find the location where they died through a process of geolocation and matching the details of an image to satellite imagery? Could we chronolocate these incidents? Could we determine the time when it actually happened or a range of time where it actually happened? Beyond that, we engaged in source analysis. Did the poster who originated this content, is it valid? Do they seem like they're a real person, or is it possibly a bot or someone who's masquerading as a real person? We also engaged in content analysis, where we carefully looked at the image itself or the visual content and tried to identify, had this been posted before, or is this the genuine context in which the description claimed it to be. We packaged all this information together, and we also found lead information for our reporters, finding family members, people who may have been at the scene, additional areas that may have had CCTV or ways to corroborate what we were finding, and we fed it to the reporters who were able to incorporate it in their work. I think what was remarkable about this was that it wasn't a final package that we gave to the reporters, but we were actively engaging with them in every step of the way, where our research fed into their reporting, and their reporting fed into our research. We were ultimately able to create that video showing the specific incident in Dawei, and we also published an article, this investigation showing exactly how Myanmar's junta has been terrorizing its citizenry. What I want to point out in this process is that it was entirely student-led. Andrea had supervised the process and really made sure that we were resilient, that we stayed safe, and that we were all right, as we were working through this extremely heavy graphic material. But I think part of the secret sauce at the investigation lab is that it's student-driven and it's student-led. And the advantages of that is that many of my teammates, they're far younger than me, they're undergraduate students, and they are far more native to the internet than I'll ever be or others in this room will ever be. Additionally, we're at UC Berkeley, they're some of the smartest people I know, and they're able to bring in innovative ideas, and they're not beholden to methodologies or tradition in ways that traditional organizations may be. And I think that's truly the secret sauce of how the investigation lab has been able to do so much incredible work over the years. It's the dedication of the students, and it's being driven by students.
Brian, did you just say some of the students you work with were much more proficient than you? Because they were younger?
That's crazy, they scare me.
Brian's 28. So tell them the quick story about what happened to you 10 years ago, which really helped you become a journalist.
Sure, so 10 years ago, that was my freshman year in college. I had, hokey dreams of being a journalist, but my parents wanted me to be a doctor. So I was working the college paper, and this was 2011, so this was during Occupy. A couple months in, an Occupy camp started off on my campus, and eventually things escalated to the point where police tried to remove the Occupy camp. One thing led to another, and a cop ended up pepper spraying the students. This was at UC Davis. I ultimately took one of those photos, which went viral, it became a huge meme, and ultimately opened the door for my journalism career.
You became a star. That was the video of an officer holding a spray and just squirting it at somebody. It got millions and millions of views. So what you're seeing, or what you're hearing from Brian, in any newsroom, he would be a superstar. Because this kind of reporting, and I think it's really important, because we're hearing a lot about the last 2 days about the colossal, unimaginable amounts of data that are now available. But what do you do with all that data? And one of the things journalists do is they work with people, and Brian is a journalist, to tell a story. And when you really have a focused goal, when you're looking for something in the data, you then tell the story. In the ideal situation, you can humanize it and really drive results, create relevance, and connect to people. I think for me, at this conference where there's a tsunami of information, some of the most powerful moments have been storytelling by people. Tanya Gersh, Stephen Jacobs, Judge Timothy Lewis, when he talked about having to sign and agree that the Klan could march in Pittsburgh, as a judge, he followed the law, but his human, when he said he was seething inside, it really resonated with me. Taylor Dumpson's story. So what I'm driving at here is that the ability of journalists to take data and information and make it relevant to people and drive change is, I think, crucial to the solutions we're talking about going forward. And now, Alexa, you're going to do just that. Talk about the impact and result, I think, of the stories, some of the stories, and what's happened because of that.
Thank you. So our interest is, of course, in supporting journalists to tell a story and lawyers to build a case, but it's actually at its heart much bigger than that. It's really about figuring out what people who have suffered enormous losses, what they want next and what they hope for themselves and for their families. And that is never going to be solved with a single story or a single case, as we know too well. So I think one of the things we've really been trying to think through is how do we help to put individuals who have gone through these injustices at the center of next steps? And what are all the ways that this kind of data and information can ultimately support them in their journey, whether it's towards some form of healing or some form of hope for the future? So in this particular context, I mean, we've seen many stories come out of Myanmar, but also we've seen the legal community really rally around these allegations of genocide and the documentation of genocide. There are now cases at the International Criminal Court, but also cases at the International Court of Justice. We've had commissions of inquiry through the United Nations. There's also a very special mechanism that has been set up to aggregate evidence of potential genocide in the Myanmar context. In this particular instance, just a few weeks ago, there was a decision in the District Court for the District of Columbia here in the United States that I think was really important for people working with social media content to be aware of. In 2019, the country, the Gambia, had filed a complaint against Myanmar in the International Court of Justice, complaining that they had violated basically the Convention on Genocide. In that particular instance, one of the things that the Gambia had noted was this 1,000 pieces of content that our team had pulled from Facebook and provided to Steve Stecklow. And the Gambia, through kind of a special mechanism by which a foreign court can request support from US courts, went to the US District Court and said, I know these 1,000 pieces of content exist. We want your help to get them from Facebook. And on September 22nd, the order came out from the US District Court compelling Facebook to turn over those 1,000 pieces of content. Now, they had been taken down and removed from public access on the internet, so there was no way to ultimately get hold of them or to know that they even existed if it hadn't been for Steve's really critical reporting. So now, one of the things that we're waiting to see, Facebook, of course, they had said in response that ultimately there are federal laws that prohibit us from turning over content, and also this would be too onerous for us to actually go and get those pieces of content. The court disagreed and ultimately said that when you take down content and you've removed it from public access, and you don't just destroy it, but you're holding onto it, in this case to analyze the ways that hate speech was being promulgated on their platform, how it was spreading, et cetera, that is information that is no longer protected by that federal law and should be provided in this instance to help support, improve these cases of genocide. From our decades in working in international criminal law, there are two things that are especially difficult to prove in court. In genocide cases, the genocide is known as the crime of intent, because not only do you have to prove the underlying crimes like rape or murder that might have been the actus reus of genocide, but you have to prove the criminal intent in the perpetrator's minds. In this case, that they committed those rapes or those killings with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a particular population because of their religion, their ethnicity, et cetera. That has been notoriously difficult to get. I think one of our hopes is that given the role of social media in often spreading information in real time, being a form of communication that is quite emotive, where people will turn to it in a moment of passion and often speak off the top of their head, later deleting their own tweets or their own posts because they realize they've in some ways shared too much, that in some ways this might actually be very helpful for us getting greater accountability for the crime of genocide. The second thing is the linkage component. So most international tribunals are going after the highest level perpetrator for the world's worst crimes. Drawing that connection from the people who are physically committing the murders or the rapes on the ground to the person who may be commanding that particular atrocity is a really difficult task. But again, social media and the digital footprints and fingerprints we are all leaving every day in digital spaces become one means of potentially drawing that line of accountability from the ground to the very highest levels. We are very eager to see how this information is received in international courts. There are a couple of very seminal cases happening right now in the International Criminal Court. In one case where you're seeing satellite imagery being pulled together with videos and photographs. Right now, we have yet to have a determination about how the judges are weighing that as potential evidence. There was a second case that had taken place in Libya against a warlord who had gone around killing, basically effectuating the extrajudicial killing of an alleged 33 people. There were 7 videos that were posted to Facebook that document those crimes. And it's the first time back in 2018 that the International Criminal Court had issued a warrant of arrest on the basis predominantly of social media-derived content. So I think we're going to be seeing this trajectory of more and more social media and public open source information coming into these very seminal trials. One of the reasons we're seeing it now is that there tends to be a 5, 10, 20-year lag of building the political will to get these cases to start moving forward or to create an international tribunal or court system that is ready to hear them. If you think back 5 to 10 years what was happening, it really was the beginning of this widespread use of social media and smartphones that I think is making these new forms of documentation and ultimately accountability possible.
Hey, did you want to talk any more about the footlocker or the protocol?
Sure. So another challenge that we are facing, of course, is that many of the pieces of content that are particularly valuable for these kinds of cases, whether it's hate speech, genocide, et cetera, is some of the most graphic material that might be posted online. It may be things like murders or beheadings, et cetera. And that is, of course, the kinds of content that violates the terms of service of most platforms, where it's going to be quickly taken down and either destroyed or held onto. One of the challenges that we are seeing is that unlike domestic contexts where law enforcement might come in quickly and make a preservation request so that that information is not destroyed but is useful for later prosecution, because of the time lag in international courts, there's no body who necessarily has the authority to make that request. And if you think about the International Court of Justice, which is a UN body, or the International Criminal Court, to which states sign on, they are not governments in and of themselves who have law enforcement powers to make those requests. So one of the challenges for international accountability is what to do with that content that's going to be removed, but has potential value for human rights, accountability, and other purposes. There is a large conversation happening right now about the potential of creating some form of digital evidence locker, whether that should be limited to having other people other than law enforcement being able to request preservation of that content, who should get access to that content is all being debated. But there are really 3 different conversations, at least that we've tracked, that are happening in parallel. One is a request that you heard earlier today around the need to have greater transparency and information about the ways that hate is circulating in these online spaces for research. With research contexts, anonymized information can often be exactly what is needed. You don't have to, which doesn't have the same kind of privacy considerations as when you're giving up the personally identifiable information. But of course, for justice and accountability, what we want is the personally identifiable information, the who is behind these particular atrocities, so that further crimes can be prevented, and ultimately we can find some kind of justice in a court of law. So that's a different track that I think we are trying to think through now. And then finally, the human rights organizations with which we work have been really quite vocal about the need to ensure that the voices of human rights activists who are often documenting crimes at great risk to themselves and trying to let the broader international community know what they're suffering, that those voices shouldn't be silenced, and that the information should be available to human rights organizations to use it for diplomatic purposes and other ways of ultimately trying to get that hate to cease.
Okay. Andrea, what's next? And, can you talk a little bit about, because I think one of the, I'll call it positive outcomes that's going on at Human Rights Center is the training of many of people like Brian and sort of the ripple effect of that, not only in the last couple of years, but what you envision going forward. Because there's an element here of the solution is people being able to do this kind of research, whether it's around hate speech, atrocities, and holding people accountable, really.
That is a hugely hopeful part of this, and we have trained hundreds of students so far, and we're part of a network around the world of others doing the same in other universities, and we've helped to support other universities in California, UC Santa Cruz and UCLA, to develop laboratories like ours to do this work. So that is super hopeful. And one of the things I wanted to mention is not just the skills that are coming into this, and I do also want to underscore Brian's point, is like students come in and they're innovators themselves, and of course technology is constantly changing, and so it's really exciting to have a space like this where students come in with new ideas. We have a lot of expertise on our staff that combines with that and a broader network to develop the skills, to develop student skills. But it's not just the skills to find and verify information that's important, which is important, but is also the process. And one of the things that we really emphasize when we train students or professionals or anybody is this whole idea of resiliency in the process. So it's not just the end game, it's how are you doing this work? And I just wanted to say briefly about that. We really prioritize that because working with hate, day in, day out, and with violence and with very graphic content or just emotionally difficult content is super hard. And so we put a lot of things in place to think about what are the tools you have to look at this, to have agency in looking at these videos, to be able to step away and to be able to keep yourself safe in a psychosocial context in this work, because it can mean that you are vulnerable to secondary trauma in working with this really traumatic content. So that's another skill that we're bringing into it. But what we're seeing is that our students are going out into the world, to newsrooms, to law firms, to UN agencies, and to other universities, and continuing this work. And so it is a tremendous ripple effect. And it's super gratifying to see that happen. Obviously, there's so much work before us, and the explosion of digital content out there can be overwhelming. And I know we've heard a number of people talk about this in the last few days, the overwhelming nature of it. But this is one way we're going to tackle it, is by giving people the tools to find and analyze this information on social media. We are seeing them seed newsrooms as well, so that's a huge part of it. So we've had students go to the New York Times, Washington Post, to other newsrooms where they're bringing these tools and techniques, and also that other bigger process of knowing how to do this safely and securely for yourself.
So we're getting close to the end, and we may even let everybody go a little early, but I have a quick question, and anybody can answer. Alexa, you've heard about all this data. What would you envision as a successful or realistic application of melding data, and how could that work to help investigators, journalists? Can you envision how and we're hearing people I keep asking, what are you doing with the data? I don't know, not you, I'm in general, in terms of as a journalist brain, I'm thinking stories, stories, stories. How do you use this? Because the stories do drive change, have impact, have results, sometimes lead to things changing, perceptions, education, you name it. So if one of the outcomes of this convening is a real push to put data together, which would be a big challenge, or somehow meld it, what would be the benefit of that?
Well, I think the gold standard in any research is always mixed methods research. I think we've heard a lot over the last 2 days around quantitative data, large data sets, but sometimes when we're merging those data sets, we may be mixing apples with oranges and really not knowing what we're ending up with and how, and therefore the quality of the predictive power of using these large quantities of information. And that's where I think the qualitative, going deep into these stories of really understanding the context on the ground, having the cultural competency, the language competency is so critical. With some of the organizations we've worked with, they may be mandated to work on, say, the Syrian conflict. And when we're talking about intergovernmental bodies, there may be no one within that organization who actually speaks Arabic. So one of the things I think we've also found is that by bringing in students who are very international and who have those cultural and language competencies and having them partner up with people who have an extraordinary amount of experience in traditional boots on the ground investigations, you're kind of merging the best of both worlds. You're taking the flexibility, innovation, creativity of these digital natives and partnering with people who deeply understand how people operate in moments of crisis and in moments of conflict. I think one thing the COVID-19 crisis, this global pandemic, has really done is created a shift in the ecosystem of human rights investigations, where a lot of these large international organizations thought, okay, doing this remote, social media-based digital stuff was kind of nice to have, and we might get around to looking at it someday or have one person on our team. It went from a nice to have to a need to have. As shelter in place said that they could no longer get into different parts of the world or leave their home countries, but also as we've seen the political context shift where humanitarian work has become increasingly dangerous and where a lot of times the political contexts are such that people are no longer being allowed, in places that they were able to get into even 3, 4, 5 years ago. So I do think it's going to be incumbent on many organizations to ensure that they have basic competencies in these skills so that they're not missing an entire area where information resides and where communication is happening. It's a huge blind spot, I think, ultimately, if we're not considering both.
Okay. So I'll just wrap up. I mean, one of the things we've really heard the last few days is how extraordinarily complicated these issues are. As a journalist, I grew up in a world where urgency was like a spike in my arm. The internet obviously accelerated that, so I think there's obviously great urgency here to deal with these problems that we're hearing about. And for the tech companies, Pandora's box is opened a millionfold in terms of trying to manage this. But I think it's really important to remember that it's not simply some high-level theoretical conversations here. Words clearly have consequences. We've heard and seen some of the victims of those consequences in the last few days, and there are millions. So this is something that I have personal urgency around, and historically, the use of information, disinformation, propaganda, lies, we know where it leads. And journalists frequently have been in the forefront of being eliminated. The Lugan press, the lying press. The Nobel Prize this year went to 2 journalists for a reason. So we should be enlisted in the cause because we're the storytellers who can really make a difference in terms of driving change, bringing children into it. One of the most powerful moments of the conference, again, was from the Illinois Holocaust Center, seeing the hologram speak to those kids. If we really want to address some of these issues around hate and how the genesis of it, it's really some of the content of things we're talking about here really have to, in the future, be aimed at children. So there's a big educational component here as well, and that also is going to involve storytelling. So I'll get off my high horse and let everybody go home a little early. So thank you.